Okay, so let's talk about the solutions that Mackie calls fallacious. He walks us through some of the most common responses that theists give to this problem of evil, and he's going to tell us why they don't work. Right. In the first case, fallacious solution number one. So, by the way, I'm going to take these in a slightly different order than Mackie lists them, because I think the second of the fallacious solutions that he lists is the easiest to understand. So that's where I'm going to begin, just FYI. So, fallacious solution number one. When presented with a problem of evil, a theist might say, well, yes, it's terrible that there is suffering in the world, but evil and suffering is necessary to bring about some good, probably some greater good, right? So some examples of trying to apply this idea. This is a very common way of thinking about personal suffering, right? If you get your heart broken, but then years later you end up meeting the right person. You end up being a stronger person after you get your heart broken, and you end up meeting the right person, and you think, wait, wow. If I had not gotten my heart broken, I wouldn't have been in a good place I wouldn't have been in the right place to meet the love of my life later on, right? So you might look back at the heartbreak in retrospect and say, well, it was terrible that I had to suffer in that way, but it was necessary to bring about this greater good of making sense of this. And we do this all the time with trying to make sense of even really heinous tragedies. I've been holed up for a while watching a lot of TV. One of the TV I've been watching is Forensic Files, right? I don't know if you're familiar with the show. There's a lot of, but it walks you through, it's a true crime program where they walk you through police investigations, right? And so there's a lot of suffering on the show. There's a lot of murders and a lot of rapes and a lot of really heinous crimes. And very, very common to see victims of the crime or the family members of the victims of crime to say that, well, it's terrible that, my loved one had to die, but it was his time to go, or some good came out of it. We started the foundation for him, or something like that, right? We wanted to bring some good out of it. And some people might look at that and say, well, it's terrible, the suffering that had to occur, but that was necessary to bring about some good. The sort of ultimate example of this line of thinking that has proven very, very controversial, by the way, has been in the 20th century, it was an open debate after among Jewish scholars after the Holocaust. This question got some new traction, as you might imagine, in the Jewish faith after the Holocaust, and a lot of Jewish scholars were wondering, well, hey, we're supposed to be God's chosen people, and yet even after, 4 millennia of terrible suffering, being constantly cast out from this place and that place, and so on, now we reach, this kind of ultimate crime, where in the 1930s and 40s, the Nazis are rounding up and committing mass genocide against the Jewish people, trying to wipe them out. And the best guess is that around 6 million Jews were just flat out murdered in the Nazi death camps in the 1940s. And so you might imagine that level of suffering kind of takes the cake, and is kind of the highest example of the kind of suffering that might be presented in this conversation. And so it leads a lot of Jewish scholars and Jewish philosophers to take a step back and wonder, well, where does the suffering of the Holocaust fit into their religious faith? Can it fit, right? One of the proposed solutions to this has been to say, well, you can't just look at the Holocaust. You have to look at what happened next, right? The Holocaust happened, and that was obviously catastrophically, historically horrible, right? But some people have pointed out, well, but as a direct result of the Holocaust, the horrors of the Holocaust, the first order of business of the young United Nations in 1945, one of the first orders of business was to establish a Jewish homeland in Israel, right? Which is considered an objective good by Jews. Some Jewish philosophers reasoned this way. They said, well, it's terrible that the Holocaust had to happen, but it was necessary as a step to bring about the good of the state of Israel, right? And we all know there was never any problems, again, in the state of Israel. Well, what's wrong with that? Well, it's actually quite simple. That's why I started with this one. So the problem is, pause. Okay, so Mackie's response to this is to say that, well, so what are we saying? Are we saying that God can't bring about good without first creating evil? Are we saying that he couldn't possibly have created the state of Israel without there first being a Holocaust? Well, if that's true, then you really don't believe that God is all-powerful. And Mackie, by the way, doesn't think that is necessarily the most illogical thing in the world, right? I mean, maybe there is this ultimate force of good out there in the universe that really wants the world to be a better place, but it can't directly, it's not all powerful. It can't directly intervene on the natural world. It has to just call people indirectly back to it, right? Mackie thinks that's not an entirely implausible idea, right? In fact, that's the position taken by some Gnostics, right? But that's not the position taken by mainstream Christianity or the other theists. They think that God is all-powerful and can directly intervene onto this world. And if that's the case, then it remains an open question of, well, why God can't create good without first creating evil. And it seems like in many cases, obviously, he can. So then, well, why can't he just bring about the good without there first being, why can't he bring about the state of Israel without there first being, 6 million Jews killed, right? So Mackie thinks this one just doesn't work. Right.
You're on.
Okay. So next, let's turn our attentions to fallacious solution number 2. Fallacious solution number 2 is where you present a theist with the problem of evil, and the theist says, well, yeah, it's too bad that suffering and evil exist, but good can't exist without evil, right? How we make this out, there might be a few ways we make this out. We might say that, well, that evil is a necessary counterpart to good, that you can't simply have something good unless you also have something evil in relation to it, right? Now, Mackie thinks that might be a consistent view of good and evil, but that's not the view that theists have. That's not the view that Christianity or Judaism or Muslim or Islam present, at least consistently. They again think that evil, that good and evil are these that have this relationship where good wants to wipe out evil, and in fact, in many of the theist traditions, there is this promise that at some point in the past there was nothing but good. Back before God created the universe, there was just God, and at some point in the future, there will be nothing but good. Evil will be perfectly vanquished, right? And if that's the case, then obviously you believe that good can exist without evil, right? And Mackie thinks this whole idea just doesn't make a lot of sense, or at least it can't be squared with the traditional view of good and evil that we find in the theist traditions. Because what it does is, he thinks, it ends up treating good and evil like they're relational properties. Relational properties are like tall and short, right? What do I mean by tall? Well, you can't really define tall unless you have something short, right? I mean, Adam Wainwright is really tall. He's 6'10", I believe, right? Tall compared to whom? Well, tall compared to me, I'm 5'7" on a good day, right? But compared to Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, he's not tall, right? So and compared to most people, both of those guys are tall, but then compared to somebody else, they're short, right? Compared to a giraffe, they're short. Well, you get the idea, right? So now, taken out of this conversation, it's important to understand, I think Mackie thinks that this is a perfectly reasonable way to look at good and evil, but it's just one that's just doesn't fit into these theistic traditions, because they don't view good and evil as being these sort of relational qualities. They view them as these kinds of absolute black and white positions, and that if you are good, you want to wipe out evil and to want there to be nothing but good. And conversely, if you're evil, you want there to be nothing but evil, right? Or at least I don't know. Who knows what evil people are. So Mackie thinks that this one just it doesn't work. It's not logical. So okay, so now we get to the good part. If you've been wondering when the good part would come, it's now. First of all, I'm going to give you the attendance password. The attendance password is church, right? Like where you go to worship God, if you're a Christian, right? So the attendance password is church. But also this is going to be the good part, because Mackie is about to get to two fallacious solutions that he thinks kind of work together, and they add up to this kind of super solution that he thinks still doesn't work, but he thinks it's the most interesting one. So, okay. So now we get to fallacious solution number 3. And this one goes this way. So when presented with the problem of evil, a theist says, well, so it's not that evil is necessary to bring about some good. And it's not that evil is necessary as a counterpart to good. But what's the case is that the universe is actually a better place with some evil in it than it could be if there were simply nothing but good. How is this the case? Well, to cut to the chase, consider, for instance, the virtues. Remember back when we talked about Aristotle in this class, right? Back in the first section of class. I know you've purged that from your memory banks, but see if you can recall any of that. Remember, Aristotle talked about virtues being this kind of most basic unit of being a morally good person, right? The virtues are the good habits of action, the ways to be excellent, right? Like kindness and charity and goodwill towards people and hard work. These are all the things that we call the virtues, right? They're the good characteristics, the good habits of action, the things that we admire in people, right? Consider that most of those virtues, maybe not all of them, but most of those virtues represent a kind of action or a habit of action in the face of some conflict or some suffering, right? For instance, kindness. To be kind to somebody requires that somebody doesn't have as much as you. It's not possible to be kind in a world where everybody has everything they need. Courage, often cited as one of the chief virtues, right? Courage is facing down danger. Well, obviously, if there is no danger, if there is no conflict, then courage would not be possible, right? So the idea here is that the existence of there being some evil in the world then that fact alone creates some kinds of good that would not be otherwise possible. It doesn't mean that it creates all good, but it means it creates some specific kinds of good, the good habits of actions, the virtues, that would not be possible otherwise. Okay, so Mackie thinks that he admits them in respect for this one. He thinks that this one's interesting. This is a particularly subtle way of handling this problem. But he thinks it runs into fundamentally two problems, the second of which he thinks is the most important. So, Okay, so Mackie's response to fallacious solution number 3, the proposal that the universe is better off with some suffering than it could be if there were none, that the existence of suffering makes possible the virtues like courage and kindness. In response to this, Mackie makes a couple observations. Well, he makes one observation and then asks a question, right? In the first case, Mackie points out, now wait a second. So what we're proposing here is for instance, a God who reasons this way, that it's terrible that people have to suffer as the result of sexual crimes and rape. But if I wiped out rape, then we would be denied the opportunities, denied the courage and kindness that is shown in rape crisis centers, right? Or the courage that is shown by rape victims. Right, and so I'm not going to do that. Right now, maybe Mackie thinks, maybe we think that is a reasonable conception of a good God. But even if you think that, Mackie says, you're forced to admit that God is not a God who cares a terrible lot about you and your life and your suffering. That God prioritizes opportunities for virtue. As his single value for this world, really, and your individual suffering doesn't really make a lot of difference to God, right? Now that Mackie assumes is going to come as cold water in the face to a lot of people who are of theistic traditions, right? Particularly people in the Christian camp, right? Who pray to God to alter their lives. I'll pray for you, I will pray for my loved ones, and God will intervene. There's nothing that God can't do. And Mackie is pointing out, well, if you're really going to make this theodicy stick, you're going to have to admit that this God doesn't really care at all about your individual suffering. What he cares about is making opportunities for people to do the right thing. And if people don't do the right thing, that's kind of not his problem, right? So now that, and maybe you're willing to accept that. I think, keep your eye on this one. I mean, Mackie kind of races past this first one. But it's going to be interesting later on. We see Swinburne's response to this problem, to revisit this one, to see if Swinburne, for all the work that he does to kind of walk back a lot of the arguments that Mackie makes here, if Swinburne ever is able to improve or really respond to the question of whether or not the God that we're left with at the end of this is a God who cares about my individual life and cares about my suffering. That seems to be the real, that seems maybe be the brass ring in all of this, and maybe the thing that nobody is able to quite get to in a plausible way. Even if Swinburne's able to defeat a lot of the other logical arguments that Mackie makes. But Mackie thinks the real takeaway, the real problem with this proposal that the universe is better off with some evil in it because evil creates opportunities for virtue. He thinks that, well, if God is so concerned about opportunities for virtue, why isn't God more concerned about preventing the vices, preventing the bad things that people do? If he's so concerned about presenting opportunities for people to show heroism and courage and kindness and so on, why doesn't he do more to prevent the suffering that results from bad human action? And then and in response to this is where we move into the fourth and final theodicy, or the fallacious solution, and it goes kind of hand in hand with the third one, and that is the proposal that God doesn't prevent bad human action because he doesn't want to interfere with our free will. Okay, So the next part of this, Mackie asked, well, why can't he asked, well, why isn't God more concerned about bad human actions? If he's so concerned about opportunities for virtue, why isn't he more concerned about bad human actions? And then this leads to the next fallacious solution that comes in tandem with the third one. And it says, well, God can't prevent evil human actions in the world because he doesn't want to interfere with our free will, right? That it is better, these people say, that God create us as free beings who sometimes do wrong than it would be for God to create us as these innocent robots who are always programmed to do good. In a world where we are all just innocent robots and we all help old ladies across the street, or we never cheat on our taxes because we are just programmed to be that way, then none of us are really doing anything good. It's only when we have a real choice between good and evil that we are capable of, and of those two choices we choose good, that we are doing a good action, right? Now, to this, Mackie deploys what I sometimes call the $1 million question, because back in the, I think, 1950s, when he first started publishing on this issue, he kind of single-handedly revived, with his article, the scholarly debate over this logical problem of evil. And he did it in large part with, a big part of that sort of new industry revolves around this question that he asks at this point. He says, well, so God doesn't interfere with evil human actions because it doesn't want to interfere with our free will. But why can't a good God, a good all-powerful God, create beings who always freely choose to do good? They always choose good, but they do it freely, right? They have a choice between right and wrong, between good and bad, between being kind or being cruel. But they just never want to be bad, unkind, or cruel. And they always make that choice, and they always do it freely, right? Now, this is the point in class where often there's hands up, and people just kind of don't understand how, on the face of it, beings that always choose good are necessarily going to be kind of mutually exclusive with beings that freely choose to do good, right? And if you think that, if you're of that stripe, then you're really going to like what Swinburne says next, right, in the next article, right? That Swinburne is really going to pick up on this one. But for now, we're not there yet. For now, to drive this point home, Mackie thinks that there are a variety of ways that we might imagine that God creates beings that have free will, but never want to use that free will to do wrong, right? Maybe we just never feel any temptation to do other than the good, right? Or think about it this way: that think about somebody in your life who is a great moral example, somebody who you think it's useful for you to ask yourself the question, well, what would this person do, right? Let's say it's a kindly old aunt. You have an old aunt who is the most wonderful person in the world that you can think of. She wouldn't hurt a fly. She is constantly, baking muffins and cookies for people. She's just the sweetheartest person in the world, right? The most sweethearted person in the world, right? So what is it that makes it so that she doesn't cheat on her taxes, right? Or so that she doesn't, lure children into her house on Halloween and poison children at Halloween, right? Why doesn't she do that? Well, you might say because, well, in the first case, it would just never occur to her that she would poison children at Halloween. And if she thought of that, she wouldn't want to. And when it comes to cheating on her taxes, well, that's the sort of thing that, might occur to anybody at some point, but she just wouldn't do that, right? Because she has good character, right? Because she just has good moral character. So now Mackie at this point would ask, well, in the first case, who is it that chooses to be obsessed with sadistic thoughts like poisoning children on Halloween, right? Nobody chooses that. I mean, there are mentally ill people who have those thoughts and can't stop thinking about them and maybe end up doing them and end up acting on them. And these are people who turn out to be, psychopaths and sadists, right? Those we typically chalk up to some sort of mental illness. And even if we think those are really bad people to live next door to, and we want those people in jail, we don't usually, Mackie thinks it doesn't make a lot of sense to think those people choose to be that sick. And so on the other hand, your aunt doesn't choose to be a kind-hearted person. She doesn't choose to only want to do good to people. Now, especially when it comes to the other issue of moral character, that she would never cheat on her taxes just because she has good moral character. Well, to that, Mackie asks the same question. Where do people get good moral character? Your aunt never didn't wake up one day and decide, you know what, from now on I'm going to have good moral character. Mackie thinks that even if we believe in free will, we are forced to admit that something like moral character is not something that we simply choose for ourselves. It is something that we come to have, be it by, probably by some combination of heredity and environment, as Blochfruit talked about earlier in this part of the class, right? So Mackie thinks, well, now wait a second. If people don't choose their whether or not they're sadists, and they don't choose whether or not they have good moral character, why doesn't God just say, boom, 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 nobody is a sadist, and everybody has good moral character, right? Would we be robots in that scenario? Would we be these beings incapable of moral goodness? Well, if you think that, then you must think that your aunt is incapable of moral goodness because she was raised right and she doesn't have sadistic urges. But we don't think that. We think, well, she's just a nice person and she deserves credit for being a nice person. Well, Mackie argues then, if God simply made us all good-hearted people who with good moral character, then we would be in no different position than your aunt is, right? And so we would be beings who always freely choose to do good. So why doesn't God create that world? And Mackie thinks, just let that question wash over you at this point, right? We've looked, he thinks, he's considered all of the sort of mainstream ways to get around this problem, and none of them work, none of them really attain. So the question remains, why does God allow evil? And Mackie thinks there's no answer to that question, that the truth of the matter is the God proposed by the theists simply could not exist. It's a long one. Okay. So that brings us to the end of our discussion. What we are going to see next is we are going to talk about Richard Swinburne, a Christian writer who is going to respond fairly point by point to a lot of Mackie's argument. But as I promised, we started off this section talking about free will. I said sort of stick that behind your ear because now we're going to talk about God, but we're going to come around talking about free will. Well, here we are. Free will is right at the heart of this. Turns out to be right at the heart of this argument about the existence of God, right? And that's where Swinburne is going to pick up. Swinburne's strategy in the next article is going to be to fortify this free will defense so that it's strong enough to stand up against Mackie's attack. Once fortified, he then sort of talks about, ways that we might think the fortifications don't work, right? Okay, but that's it. Take care. Be safe.